Hi, and welcome to this educational model. My name is Juan Pablo de Anda de Alba, and throughout the span of this podcast, I will be talking with you about a very interesting topic that has much to be discussed: indigeneity and the LGBTQ+ community in African countries. First of all, I will be addressing indigeneity in Africa. What is an indigenous person? Where are they from? The Americas, Australia, Africa? And if there are indigenous peoples in Africa, who could be considered one and who couldn't? Does European colonization and decolonization make African people indigenous? And secondly, I will be addressing the LGBTQ+ community in the African countries throughout the continent. What problems does such community currently faces in these African countries? Where does this lack of acceptance and problems regarding their existence comes from? Was this intolerance brought into the region by European imperialist countries during colonialism? Is it native to the pre-colonial African cultures, or is it a combination of these two? Also, why do African countries refuse to acknowledge the existence of the LGBTQ+ community? So, without further ado, let's begin. We're going to start with indigeneity in African communities. When we speak about indigenous people, it is very common for us to think of them as being native to either the Americas or Australia. Those are the first places most people think of when discussing them. But what is an indigenous person in the first place? The origin of the word indigenous comes from the Latin indigena, which means sprung from the land, native. Even though attempts to assign a unique definition for the indigenous peoples have been opposed by both the indigenous rights movement and the United Nations, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations website offers the following definition for them. Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. Despite their cultural differences, indigenous peoples from around the world share common problems related to the protection of their rights as distinct peoples. Indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. Despite their cultural differences, indigenous peoples from around the world share common problems related to the protection of their rights as distinct peoples. Having said this, we understand why the indigenous populations of both Australia and the Americas can be more easily distinguished as being indigenous than those in other places around the world. These people live in dominant societies which were implemented on their native lands by imperialistic countries such as Spain, Britain, France, among others, and even though one does not need to have a specific set of phenotypic traits to be an indigenous person, in these territories it can be somewhat common for them to share phenotypic traits that are frequently seen among the indigenous peoples of the region. But how does this definition apply to African people? Well, it applies in a similar way, but we first have to look back at the historical context of the continent. During the European colonization of the African countries, which started during the 1880s, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Britain, Spain, and Portugal took over almost the entire continent and split it amongst them. Most of these major powers created and settled their own extractive colonies throughout the continent and proceeded to extract the resources of the land without mingling much with the local populations of the continent. European settlers did not mix with African people like they did at high rates in Latin America. These European colonizers mostly subjugated the local populations and exploited the people and the natural resources of the land. Mr. Nigel Crahall, the director of the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, says that it was during this period of African colonization in which European countries created a political and economic hierarchy that favored and privileged, in a minimal way, the sedentary agricultural, food-producing peoples of the region over the nomadic hunters, gatherers, and herder populations. The minimal privileges that the food-producing populations received ranged from minimal healthcare to a deficient education, but compared to receiving even less or nothing, like the rest of the populations of the region did, it was the best position a local could have within a European colony in Africa. Unfortunately, after World War II ended and the continent started to decolonize itself from these European countries, the people that had received minimal privileges during colonial rule were the ones that managed to stay in power and run the social and political power institutions of the newly independent countries, further marginalizing the rest of the pastoral and hunter-gatherer nomadic populations, which would rather start identifying themselves as indigenous. In Africa, you have the population that's part of the mainstream society, and you have part of the population that has been relegated and subjugated by the dominant groups of the African countries for being different, outdated, or for not fitting into the model of modernity within the African society. These latter groups are the ones that have been identifying as indigenous in a constant fight to achieve equity, equality, and the freedom to operate in a system that makes it almost impossible for them to live the way they have been for thousands of years. It can then be said that the term indigenous is used somewhat differently within Africa. Such term has been adopted by several ethnic groups around the continent that still preserve much of their culture, modes of production, religion, economic and political systems, and are trying to protect not only their heritage, human rights, and their culture, but also their very own existence from the ongoing discrimination, marginalization, and threats that they have to experience by the dominant groups on a daily basis within their countries. Even though all Black Africans within the continent could be considered to be indigenous peoples in the sense that they were inhabitants of the continent before imperialist powers arrived, not many Black Africans opt to identify as such. Instead, it is more common for specific marginalized ethnic groups of people throughout the continent to adopt the term indigenous to their very own specific situations of marginalization and oppression regarding their culture and ways of living. However, these people have given the word indigenous a wider meaning that is not necessarily bound to the concept of aboriginality. This allows these groups of people to seek greater protections and affirmative actions within their national governments and international mechanisms that might help alleviate their unfortunate situations. Adopting the term indigenous is a way for them to differentiate from the rest of the mainstream population, to seek recognition, and is also used to try to tackle the problems that their communities are facing. Even though the term indigenous is used as a way to differentiate who came first to a determined place, ethnic groups in Africa also use it quite often as a tool to maintain and protect their cultures from going extinct. Some of the main ethnic groups who identify as indigenous in Africa include the hunter-gatherer communities of the Yaku and Senwer of Kenya, the Hadzabe of Tanzania, the San of the southernmost part of the African continent, and the Pygmies of the Great Lakes region. As for the pastoralist communities of the continent that identify themselves as indigenous, these include the Barabaig of Tanzania, the Masai of Tanzania and Kenya, the Samburu, Rendil, and Dorois, Borana, and Turkana of Kenya, the Tuareg, Tubu, and Fulani of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, the Karamajong of Uganda, in Namibia, the Himba, and finally the Pokot of Uganda and Kenya. As of European colonization, it can then be said that the colonial hierarchical systems that they implemented among African people within their colonies during the colonization process greatly increased the need of non-food producing Africans to identify themselves as indigenous. Those same systems are still present today and have been perpetuated by the dominant groups of the now independent African countries. These are the same ones that have divided African people and relegated the now identified as indigenous populations of the continent. The usage of the term can then be attributed in part to the European colonization of African countries, but also to the continuation of these colonial subjugating systems which were carried on by subsequent African dominant groups after decolonization. Indigenous peoples do exist in Africa and they have been around for millions of years. The denominations of indigeneity in the continent relies on the self-identification of ethnic groups as indigenous. However, the African population that has decided to adopt this term has been primarily the pastoralist and hunter-gatherer ethnic communities that started to be subjugated under the hierarchical colonial system that is still in effect under the control of actual African dominant groups. These groups decide to adopt this term in order to be granted rights that will protect their communities from going extinct, to differentiate themselves from the mainstream African society, and be able to defend their culture, modes of production, religions, and to eventually continue to effectuate their traditional lifestyles in countries that continue to marginalize and discriminate against them. Now it's time to talk about the LGBTQ+ community in African countries. As of today, the existence of people that identify as members of the LGBTQ+ community throughout Africa is irrefutable. However, the vast majority of these people currently faces rejection, intolerance, stigmatization, as well as punishments that can deprive them from their own existence if they are caught engaging in homosexual practices. But why are African countries so reluctant to homosexuality and the LGBTQ+ community in general? In order to be able to answer this question, we have to go back again to the European colonization of Africa. Even though this was not the first time European powers intervened in the region, it was during these specific periods, starting in the 1880s, that European powers did not only subjugate and exploited the local populations and the natural resources of the region, as previously explained, but they also made it easier for Christian missionaries to implement their sets of beliefs and introduce Christianity into the region, which was often imposed over the local pre-colonial African religions, as well as the prohibition of homosexual practices and any sort of gender identity that differed from European standards in the colonized territories. Within the colonized territories throughout Africa, pre-colonial religions such as the Igbo in Nigeria, the Shona in Zimbabwe, and the Bwiti in Gabon, to name just a few, experienced repression, persecution, and abuses from Christian missionaries that started to arrive in the region during this period. The Shona religion in Zimbabwe is a compelling example that further demonstrates these abuses. In Zimbabwe, Christian missionaries refused to accept the pre-colonial religion of the Shona people under the premise of rejecting paganism and fetish idolatry. This created a series of tense and hostile attitudes towards the Shona people that went from the persecution of Shona priests, the discreditation of their religion, the destruction of their sacred holy places, and went all the way up to prohibiting them from worshipping their own god known as Mwari. Another unfortunate example of this is that of the Botswana people and their religion, Tswana, in what is now the country of Botswana. The European Christian missionaries, which oftentimes carried prejudices and erroneous information on the Botswana people, managed to distort the Tswana religion, degrading it to a set of illogical beliefs created by uncivilized individuals. The lack of sacred monuments to worship their supreme being, known as Modimo, was another reason for the missionaries to state that such culture had been ravaged by the devil, leaving no trace of any kind of religion, and as a result, Christianism was needed to vindicate them. Cases like this replicated throughout the continent, and the introduction and imposition of Christianity by Christian missionaries, especially during colonialism, is one of the reasons as to why Christianism is today the predominant religion in the sub-Saharan African countries. Several gender identities and homosexual sexual practices were also common among the rich and diverse pre-colonial African cultures. In ancient Egypt, eunuch was the term of the third gender that coexisted alongside males and females. This third gender was assigned to males that decided not to procreate or were unable to, and used to be worshipped within the Egyptian society. In what is now known as Ghana, babies were not given a gender based on their anatomy. Instead, they analyzed their energy, and based on that, they would be assigned a gender. In Uganda, within the Langi people, there were effeminate males known as Mudoko Dako that had the possibility to marry men and be treated as women within their society. Now, when it comes to homosexual sexual practices, the pre-colonial African cultures would engage not only in erotic homosexual practices, but also in non-erotic ones. For example, in Zimbabwe, two men that appear to be having a form of ritual sex can be appreciated in the ancient cave paintings of the Sand people. In Namibia and Angola, it was believed that female spirits could be transferred from men to men through anal sex by a caste of male diviners, known as the Svibanda, Gangas, Kibamba, Chivalos, and Kimbala. And in the countries of Tanzania, Nigeria, and Kenya, the Nandi, Xi, Igbo, Kuria, and Nuer people of the corresponding territories still engages in female same-sex marriages for diplomatic, economic, and reproductive means. These same-sex practices and gender identities used to be common and accepted within pre-colonial African cultures. It was not until Islam and Christianity arrived in the continent that these practices started to face rejection and ended up being criminalized in the constitutions of the former colonies, further depriving the members of these cultures from an essential part of their identity. It can then be said that this set of repressive historic events and measures have set the basis for the very conservative and homophobic societies along the different African countries that exist today. However, it is also important to acknowledge that before the European colonization of the region, Muslim colonization of the northern parts of the continent also propagated intolerant views on homosexuality and also imposed Islam on local populations, further adding to the intolerance that's experienced today. That is why much of the LGBTQ+ community in Africa faces such high rates of homophobia. It is also a common belief among African countries to think of homosexuality and the LGBTQ+ community as something brought into the continent by the West. These topics and activities are often referred to as un-African, but as it has been explained before, that is just not true. Homosexual practices, relationships, and diverse gender identities were present in the pre-colonial African cultures well before colonization began. A clear example of these are the words that can be found within languages of some pre-colonial African cultures to talk about same-sex practices. Inkochane was the term used to refer to same-sex relations by the Shangaan people of southern Africa, and in the western part of the continent, in Senegal, Gordigen is the word in the wall of language used to describe homosexual men. Homosexuality was not brought into the African continent by the West. Homophobia was. In 2017, in Zambia, 2 men were arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison for engaging in same-sex relations. In that same year, in Tanzania, 8 men and 12 women were arrested in a hotel after receiving HIV/AIDS education programs and were charged for alleged homosexuality. To this day, 32 African countries still criminalize homosexuality in their penal codes with imprisonment, 4 with the death penalty, and in only 22 African countries, homosexuality is legal. To finish up the educational model, it is important that we understand and recognize that indigenous people do exist in Africa. Despite having followed a somewhat different process of identification than indigenous people in Australia or in the Americas, Africa is home to thousands of ethnic groups that have started to identify themselves as indigenous in the past couple of decades after years of systematic abuses, discrimination, marginalization exerted on them first by the European colonizing powers and later on by the food-producing agricultural dominant groups that managed to stay in positions of power after the decolonization of the continent. It is of extreme importance for these indigenous peoples to recognize as such and to adopt the indigenous label in order to be able to protect their cultures, religions, modes of productions, traditions, languages from going extinct, and also to be able to organize among themselves with other indigenous peoples and with national and international organisms to keep fighting for public policies and affirmative actions that not only improve their reality, but that also allows them to live in their own different lifestyles without forcing them to assimilate into a mainstream modern African society. And finally, European and Muslim colonization of the African continent can also be the main reason as to why African countries face such high rates of homophobia and intolerance towards the LGBTQ+ community today. The imposition of Christianity and Islam over the pre-colonial African cultures paved the way for intolerance and rejection towards homosexuality and resulted in highly conservative, homophobic, and anti-LGBTQ+ community countries that to this day refuse to acknowledge that homosexuality and other forms of gender identity have always been a part of pre-colonial African cultures and were not brought into the continent by the West.